You are now listening to the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. All right, guys, welcome to another episode of the Protestant Libertarian Podcast. It is really good to have you guys on the show with me this week. This is going to be a little bit of a follow-up episode. So we spent a couple of weeks, and I'm not sure, depending on, I'm recording this at the very beginning of November, and I have a couple of interviews lined up and some other stuff that I want to cover on the show. So I'm not sure if this is going to be sequential or not. But we spent a couple of weeks taking a look at Murray Rothbard's essay, The Anatomy of the State. If you haven't listened to those episodes yet, please go back and do so. Murray Rothbard is, of course, kind of the great libertarian philosopher and economist, and he wrote this incredible essay back in the mid-1970s called The Anatomy of the State, and in it, he tries to explain at its core what a state actually is. He tries to reduce the concept of the state down to its basic element, and in Murray Rothbard's essay, he says that the state is basically comprised of two functions. The first thing that a state does is it has a monopoly on violence in a given territorial area. So a state has to be in control of some geographic region, and within that geographic region, the state gets to exercise violence basically at its discretion, and it gets to decide who can and who cannot exercise violence within its borders. And so one of the characteristics of a state is that the state has a monopoly on violence in a society. That's the first characteristic. And the second characteristic that Murray Rothbard outlines in this essay is that the state can only generate revenue through coercive means. So in other words, the state doesn't actually produce a good or a service that people purchase on the market. There's no voluntary exchange with the state. Instead, what the state does is it uses its monopoly on violence to collect taxes from people, and that is how the government funds all of its workings. And so for Murray Rothbard, those are the two things that make up the state. The state has a monopoly on violence, and the state can only generate revenue through coercion and force. The state doesn't make any money through transactional means. And so in his essay, he explains kind of how that works out from the perspective of somebody that is looking at a state. So this is a model that could be applied to any and every state throughout human history. And one of the things that I wanted to do with this show, after taking a look at Murray Rothbard's essay, is look at a couple of biblical passages where I think the themes that Murray Rothbard alludes to in his work are elucidated in the scripture. And so what I'm not going to do today and in next week's episode or whenever, we're going to do an Old Testament text today and a New Testament text next time around whenever that episode finally airs. What I'm not going to do that we need to talk about for a minute is take Murray Rothbard's ideas and import them into scripture. I am not making the argument today that Murray Rothbard's analysis of the state can be found explicitly in the Bible. And this is one of the problems that I have with the way that modern political concepts are often used in conversations about, biblical justification for them, is that there are a lot of people that make the assumption that whatever their contemporary political values are, whether I agree with those values or not, they believe that those political values are found explicitly in the scripture, and they'll always go back to the Bible and try to find proof texts that will prove their point. And so one of the things that is maybe uncomfortable about the way that some libertarians, for instance, have approached the Bible is that they find a theme in the Bible, which is legitimately there, that is also a theme that is kind of expressed within libertarian philosophy. And they'll say that that modern libertarian philosophical concept is explained in the scriptures, and it's not, because we're taking a modern concept and we are trying to find justification for that modern concept in the ancient world. And I don't think that that's a very good way of doing biblical interpretation. Instead, what we're going to be doing is, now that we understand how Murray Rothbard articulates the functions of the state as being the power that has monopoly on violence and as generating revenue through coercion, we're going to see how those two concepts are found in certain places in the scriptures. But what I'm not claiming is that the Bible is going to be a direct parallel to the anatomy of the state. That's not it at all. I'm just saying that some of the ideas that Murray Rothbard picks up in Anatomy of the State are also present in the scriptures, and we're going to look at how those those ideas play out within the context of the Bible. So again, this is not me imposing Rothbard's model of statehood on the scriptures. This is me saying that there's a parallel between Murray Rothbard's analysis of the state and the way that the writers of the Bible critique state power as well. So I have to say that up front because, again, as a Protestant who believes in the authority of Scripture, it's very, very difficult for us to not import modern categories into these ancient texts and try to find ancient justification for modern concepts. Now, that's not to say that concepts that have been developed over time don't correspond to ideas that we find in the Bible. I definitely think that that is the case, that there are, because again, human knowledge has developed over the last 2,000 years, so we find new ideas and new concepts that might have a precedent in the Scripture, but that doesn't mean that they're fully articulated there, because again, if no one in the ancient world, and there are plenty of ancient writers like Plato and Aristotle that have these kind of really deep philosophies of government and of statehood and of things like that, and I think that the writers of the Old Testament and even some of the writers of the New Testament do have a philosophy of the state, but they don't articulate it in the way that modern political commentators do. Again, you're not going to find a fully fleshed out libertarian ideology or a fully fleshed out conservative or progressive ideology anywhere at all in the Scripture. And I think when progressives or conservatives or libertarians try to find explicit justifications for their political beliefs in the Bible, that they're always going to wind up making mistakes, and they're going to wind up again using the Bible to justify positions that were not created until the modern world. And we're going to try to avoid that at all costs today. But the Bible does deal with these issues of power, and I would say even going back to Genesis, like to the earliest chapters of the Bible, the writers of Scripture have a very complex and often negative view of human power that is often extended to the government. And so for the writers of the Bible, the ones that do comment on government and on power often seem to be very skeptical of it. And I think that we live in a post-Enlightenment world where we're so used to the idea of having kind of this innocuous democratic government. We believe that the government is a legitimate organization and society that we can miss because of the way that we've been taught to think about government, some of the very obvious critiques of government and human power that are found in the Scriptures. And so the language about government, of course, is not uniform throughout Scriptures, as we're going to see the writer of 1 Samuel, and we're going to look at 1 Samuel chapter 8 today, and then Romans chapter 13 the next time we take a look at a biblical passage having to do with comparing it to the anatomy of the state. The language that they use about government is not uniform, and it could seem like these two concepts are actually contradicting each other, but we have to try to understand that the principles about the nature of human government that are woven throughout both of these texts are, I think, fundamentally the same, and they are deeply skeptical of humans' ability to manage power, especially when that power is used to control how other people behave. And again, I am absolutely not saying that the writers of the Bible were libertarians. They were not. Libertarianism is a post-Enlightenment, a political philosophy. It is not something that was developed at all in the ancient world. I'm just saying that I do think that there are some, and again, one of the reasons why I am a libertarian is because my reading of particular political and anthropological passages in the Bible pushed me to the conclusion that people ought not to exercise power over other people, and that drove me into libertarianism. They are different, but if it wasn't for the biblical, the way that I think the power is presented in the Bible, I don't think that I would be a libertarian today. I think one flows from the other, but I'm not going to impose all my libertarian beliefs on the Scriptures and try to find textual justifications for them in the Bible. I just don't think that that's the way that it works. So again, as I said before, I think one of the best critiques of human government in all of the Bible is found in 1 Samuel 8. But before we can get into 1 Samuel 8, we have to understand it within the context of the rest of the Old Testament story. 1 Samuel 8, for those of you that aren't familiar with the Bible, is in the histories, and it's about halfway through the Old Testament. And so there is a very long story leading up to 1 Samuel 8 that we have to try to understand if we are going to faithfully interpret the significance of 1 Samuel 8 for our purposes today, trying to analyze what the writer of 1 Samuel 8 thought about the nature of human government. And so I'm going to give you guys a little bit of that Old Testament background today. Now, again, we're dealing with massive ideas on the show today, and so I'm going to have to paint with a very, very broad brush. Again, I want to do this podcast for a couple of years. I hope that we can go through most of the Old Testament and kind of draw out the significance of some key Old Testament passages and themes in terms of the way that they relate to libertarian philosophy. We obviously don't have time to do that today. So we're going to focus on 1 Samuel 8 because it deals with kingship and the nature of kingship within Israel, but we have to understand the background of the Old Testament if we want to understand 1 Samuel 8. So I know for those of you that maybe are more familiar with the Bible or even come from a biblical studies background, this is not going to satisfy you very much because this is kind of like a 3,000-foot overview perspective of the Old Testament, but I think it's going to be really helpful to locate 1 Samuel 8 within the broader story of the OT. The OT, of course, being an abbreviation for Old Testament. I hate using OT and NT, and so I apologize for doing that. I'll try not to do it anymore. So again, from a big picture perspective, the Bible starts out with the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, and Genesis 1 through 11 is a prologue for the Pentateuch. The Pentateuch is the term for the first 5 books of the Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And the Pentateuch deals with the story of Abraham's family, which will be known as Israel, and then God giving Abraham's family the law. But of course, we don't know why God needed to call Abraham or his family in the first place unless we had the backstory for the calling of Abraham. And that's what the first 11 chapters of Genesis are designed to do. They are Israel's backstory. They're the prologue to the narrative of the Pentateuch, and they're designed to give the audience the background knowledge that they need to understand God's calling of Abraham in Genesis chapter 12. And so in Genesis chapter 1 and 2, you have God creating the world and God putting man and woman in the garden, and God gives in Genesis chapter 1 verses 27, he creates human beings in his image and likeness, and he gives them dominion over his creation. So and in there's some really good books on this. John Walton is an Old Testament scholar, I think, from Wheaton, and he has a book called The Lost World of Genesis 1, or The Lost World of Creation. I have to take a look at the name on my bookshelf, but I'll put a reference to it in the show notes. But in that book, he argues that the way that creation is portrayed in Genesis chapter 1 and 2 is that God creates this very good physical world, and then he creates human beings to rule over this world in the same way that priests were supposed to rule over the temple. And so John Walton makes the argument that if you look at Genesis 1 and 2 from the perspective of the ancient Near East, that it looks as if God is creating the universe as his temple, and human beings are supposed to be the priests that wisely preside over that temple. And so in the garden, God gives the man and the woman absolutely everything that they need to survive and to thrive, and all the man and the woman have to do is put their trust in God, and everything will go just as God intended it to be. And so again, Genesis 1 and 2 is foundational for the rest of Scripture. The world that God creates is very good. The people that God created, man and woman, both represent, and this is really important too and often overlooked, that man and woman both equally represent the image of God, that if man and woman do that, then everything will work out the way that it was intended. And so Genesis 1 and 2 is supposed to be the model for God's good creation. But in Genesis chapter 3, human beings are given a choice. In the garden, there is the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they are commanded specifically not to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. But what do the man and the woman do? They're tempted to eat from that tree, and they do it. And the problem, as the writer of Genesis says in Genesis chapter 3, is that by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, human beings were attempting to try to be like God. They wanted to know good and evil in order that they could be like God. And so the fundamental sin, and I don't like the language of original sin very much, but the original human sin was the sin of pride and power, trying to be like God, grasping for the knowledge of good and evil. And after Genesis chapter 3, we can see that all chaos breaks loose. So human beings have disobeyed God, God. They get kicked out of the garden because they tried to be like him, because they tried to grasp for power, and all of the stories that are contained in the prologue. And again, a lot of very famous biblical stories. Cain and Abel is in Genesis chapter 4, Noah and the flood is Genesis chapter 6, and then the Tower of Babel is Genesis chapter 11. All three of those stories are designed to show that after the original human sin of trying to be like God by eating from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the problems of the human race only continued to grow larger. Human life continued to get worse and worse. The good creation that God made was worse off because of it. And so at the end of Genesis chapter 11, we're left with this really powerful and moving image of God being disappointed that he created human beings because they screwed up his good creation and they failed to live up to the standards that God set for them. They failed to live up to their purpose. And again, just right there, before we move on to the calling of Abraham, it's really important to remember that the event that set all of this in motion was in Genesis chapter 3, when human beings are portrayed as grasping for power. They wanted to be like God. And so it's this idea that human beings should be able to control their own destiny and have their own power that makes that takes God's good creation and absolutely wrecks it. And I think a lot of people miss that. But again, Genesis chapter 3 is a very, very subtle, actually, I don't think it's that subtle at all. It's a very obvious critique of the human desire and drive for power, but it's told in a very nuanced and subtle way. And so again, the fundamental sin, I think, for all human beings, this is myself included, is this idea that we always want power. We always want more than what we were given. Like, we don't want to rely on what God has provided for us. We don't want to rely on other human beings. We want to rely on ourselves, and we want to rely on the power that we think that we can get. And this is foundational to the story in Genesis. And so obviously you get to the end of Genesis chapter 11, everything's all screwed up, but God has a plan to set things right. So God calls this man named Abram, who is going to be renamed Abraham later on in the story, and he promises Abraham that he's going to have this giant family and that Abraham's family will be a blessing to the nations. And again, the idea of Genesis 12, 1 through 3 within the context of the passages that precede it, Genesis 1 through 11, is that Abraham's family is going to be is called by God to undo all of the problems that were created by the human rebellion in the garden. And so Israel is supposed to be a blessing to the nations. Israel is Abraham's family, and to reveal God to the world. And so God is going to make a covenant with Abraham and a covenant with his family, and God promises that he's going to bless Abraham's family so that they could be a light to the nations. But they can only do this if they are distinct and unlike the other nations. So Israel has to stand out. They have to separate themselves from the nations that are around them so that they can be a blessing to the nations. The nations should look to Israel as kind of like the true humanity, the faithful humanity, so that they can see what life was supposed to be like, what life was intended to be like. Now, the rest of the Pentateuch is going to tell the story of Abraham's family, and we're going to see Abraham's family in Exodus being rescued from slavery in Egypt and then given the Ten Commandments, which is the foundation for the law. And then in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, God is going to outline the law that he gives to Israel. And again, the law in Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, and this goes back to the Ten Commandments in Exodus, which is kind of like the foundation of all of the laws that God gives to his people Israel. These are designed to be kind of the social and the political and the theological standards for the people of God, and they were designed deliberately to separate or distinguish Israel from the nations. And again, this is what we call a covenant. So God makes this covenant with Abraham's family, and the covenant goes like this. It's the very same covenant that God makes with the man and the woman in the garden. If Israel is faithful and follows the law and is distinguished from the rest of the nations, then God will bless Israel, and his purposes in calling them in the first place will be fulfilled. If Israel chooses not to follow the law, then God will withhold his blessings from Israel, and again, they will wind up falling in the same way that the man and the woman fall in the garden. And again, you can see this in Leviticus. One of the phrases in Leviticus is always, "Be holy because I am holy." And the idea here is that Israel is supposed to separate itself from the nations that are around them. That's what the concept of holiness means in the Bible, that Israel is not supposed to be like the other nations. And so very famously at the very end of the Pentateuch in Deuteronomy 27 through 30, God lays out this covenant, lays out this contract with the family of Abraham. And he says, look, if you follow the covenant, things are going to go your way. You will have all these blessings. You're going to live in a land that I'm going to give you. The nations will flock to you. Everyone will finally know me. Everything's going to be great. But if you fail to be obedient to the law, if you fail to be faithful to me, if you make yourselves like the nations that are around you, then everything is going to be really, really bad. You're going to wind up losing the land. You're going to be taken into exile. I'm going to withhold my promise to you, and I'm going to punish you because you did not live up to your end of the covenant contract. And that's where we're at the end of chapter, at the end of Deuteronomy. Israel is given basically the same choice that the man and the woman is given. Faithfulness is going to lead to the people of God being what God intended them to be, a light to the nations, and failure will result in only more pain and suffering and chaos. And the rest of the Old Testament histories that follow that, really Joshua, the book that comes after Deuteronomy, is kind of the high point. But after Joshua, we see over and over again the writers of the Old Testament showing how Israel consistently fails to follow the covenant, that they don't actually live up to the standards that God had set for them. And one of the most profound ways that they do this is that they're constantly trying to be like the nations that are surrounding them. Instead of standing out as a light to the nations, they want to assimilate and accommodate all of the values and the beliefs and the practices of the nations that surround them. And this is where we see idolatry, and this is where we see Israel ignoring the law, and this is where we see all the violence and the bloodshed in the Old Testament. Most of the pain and suffering that is described in the Old Testament is described in explicitly covenantal context, where the writers of the Bible, the writers of the history want to show that Israel failed to live up to the standard that God set for them. They didn't follow their end of the covenant, and God gives them so many chances to make a better choice and to try again, and Israel just continues to refuse to be obedient to God because they want to be like the other nations. And this is the Old Testament background. You have a good world that God created. Human beings mess it up because of their desire to grasp for power and to be like God. God calls Abraham's family to undo the problems that human beings created. He makes a contract or a covenant with Abraham's family, Israel, and then Israel continues to break that contract repeatedly while God tries to get them on track. And so this is going to lead us to 1 Samuel. And 1 Samuel is one of the most important history books in all of the Old Testament. If you haven't read it, I would highly recommend going back and doing that. And of course, you're going to have to read Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings if you want the entire story, and then Ezra and Nehemiah after that to finish out the end of the exile. But we've said enough already on the show today that we have gotten to the point where we can finally understand 1 Samuel in its context. And again, I know that was kind of a long ride, but one of the problems that I have when people that are trying to combine ideas from the modern world use the Bible is that they often will only look at a passage in isolation instead of trying to set that passage within its historical and scriptural context. And so I wanted to make sure that we did that today. So so Samuel is a great prophet. God calls Samuel to be one of the greatest prophets of Israel. And before Samuel, Israel, of course, they were getting themselves in all kinds of problems because they were compromising their values with the nations that were around them. In the book of Judges, I read a really great book over the summer by a scholar named David Feldman. The book is called Deserting the King, and it's a commentary on the book of Judges. I'm going to try to have Feldman on the show, by the way, one time. I sent him my notes, and I got a confirmation. We just need to get a date set up. It's an incredible book. But what Feldman argues is that if you look in the book of Judges, Israel is finally in the land, and they get themselves into all of these problems. And so God has to raise up a judge that rules the people of Israel, not as a king. These judges are explicitly not kings, but they rise up to rule the people of Israel, to save them from a particular problem that is the result of Israel trying to accommodate the nations or trying to be like the nations around them. And as soon as the judge rescues Israel from their problems, the judge then leaves that office. So there's no kingship or anything like that. And again, from the perspective of the book of Judges, and David Feldman Belman makes this point in his book, God is supposed to be king. That's why God doesn't call a king in the book of Judges. He relies on the judges themselves. God is supposed to be king because the idea of like a hereditary kingship of a large monarchy was an idea that was associated with the pagan nations that surrounded Israel. It was not supposed to be the model of government that Israel itself used. Israel was supposed to be a pure theocracy, a people, a nation that was completely ruled by the contract that they had made with their God. And there was not supposed to be a king that was involved in that process. But over the course of the book of Judges, which again precedes 1 Samuel, we see that over and over and over again, Israel fails. And over and over again, God sends these judges to rescue them. But at the very beginning, Israel's failures are not as severe as they are at the very end. And Belman does a great job of explaining that the book of Judges shows the deterioration of the nation of Israel to the point where they want to completely capitulate and look like the nations that surround them. So God calls Samuel, and Samuel helps kind of manage some of these judges. But we get to a point in 1 Samuel and 1 Samuel 8 where Israel is no longer happy with the judge system. And here's what the writer of Samuel says. This is 1 Samuel chapter 8. He says, "It came about when Samuel was old that he appointed his sons judges over Israel. Now the name of his firstborn was Joel, and the name of his second Abijah. They were judging in Beersheba. His sons, however, did not walk in his way, but turned aside after dishonest gain and took bribes and perverted justice. Then all the elders of Israel gathered together and came to Samuel at Ramah, and they said to him, 'Behold, you have grown old, and your sons do not walk in your ways. Now appoint a king for us to judge us like all the nations.'" That's verse 5 there. So again, Israel's request very explicitly here in 1 Samuel 8:5 is that they will be given a king so that they can be like the nations that are surrounding them. That's the point. They want to look like the nations that neighbor them, which is, of course, a giant breach of the covenant with God. Of course, Samuel is a righteous man, and so the writer of 1 Samuel is going to go on, and he says this about Samuel. "But the thing was displeasing in the sight of Samuel, and they said, 'Give us a king to judge us.' And Samuel prayed to the Lord. The Lord said to Samuel, 'Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them.'" Again, this goes back to like what Belman was arguing in his book, Deserting the King, that God is supposed to be the king of Israel. It's a covenantal theocracy. Israel's made a contract. God is their king. And by asking for a monarchy, by asking for a hereditary kingship, they are rejecting God as their king. Again, things are going from bad to worse with Israel. 1 Samuel continues, and this is the voice of God here. "Like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, and that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them." And this is where it gets really interesting, okay? Because obviously Israel is rejecting the fact that God is supposed to be their only king. And again, God is very, very accommodating towards his people, and he still is. Of course, I have a million problems, and God constantly accommodates me. So this isn't sort of Gentile, anti-Judaism, ethnocentrism, or anything like that. So God is very patient with his people, and he says, sure, I'm going to let them have a king, but here's what's going to happen when Israel has a king like the rest of the nations. And so he says, again, tell them of the procedures of the king. And so 1 Samuel 8, it's going to go on. It says, this is starting in verse 10. "So Samuel spoke all the words of the Lord to the people who had asked of him a king. He said, 'This will be the procedure of the king who will reign over you. He will take your sons and place them for himself in his chariots and among his horsemen, and they will run before his chariots. He will appoint for himself commanders of thousands and of 50s, and some to do his plowing and to reap his harvest and to make his weapons of war and equipment for his chariots. He will also take your daughters for perfumers and cooks and bakers. He will take the best of your fields and your vineyards and your olive groves and give them to his servants. He will take a tenth of your seed and of your vineyards and give to his officers and to his servants. He will also take your male servants and your female servants and your best young men and your donkeys and use them for his work. He will take a tenth of your flocks, and you yourselves will become his servants. Then you will cry out in that day because of your king, whom you have chosen for yourselves, but the Lord will not answer you in that day. Nevertheless, the people refused to listen to the voice of Samuel, and they said, No, but there shall be a king over us, that we also may be like all the nations, that our king may judge us and go out before us and fight our battles. Now after Samuel had heard all the words of the people, he repeated them in the Lord's hearing. The Lord said to Samuel, Listen to their voice and appoint them a king. So Samuel said to the men of Israel, Go back, every man to his city. So again, if you listen to the 2 episodes before about Murray Rothbard's concept of the anatomy of the state, where the state has a monopoly on violence in a given territorial area and they generate revenue through coercion, it is very clear that a lot of the same concerns about state power are articulated by the writer of 1 Samuel 8. And so again, we see at the very beginning, and the critique starts in verse 10 if you want to follow along at home, but you see at the very beginning that the implementation of the king will immediately lead to like a military industrial complex, because the king is going to have chariots and horsemen, and he's going to have to conscript people to fight for him. And so there's this automatic connection between monarchy and war in 1 Samuel 8. And again, there are parts of the Old Testament that are very, very violent, and we have to understand war as an aspect of the degeneration of the human race, for sure. It's the way it's presented in the Old Testament. But you can see here that when Israel has a monarchy, they're going to fight more, and there are going to be people that are going to go out and fight, and the government is going to have to pay for the implements of war that will be used in fighting. And so there's an inherent militarism that is characteristic of the government that they are going to be imposing upon themselves by asking for a king. If you want to be like the nations, you're going to have to fight like the nations. He then, the writer of 1 Samuel then talks about how daughters are going to be taken for perfumers and cooks and bakers, and that he is going to take the best of the fields, and that the king will take 1/10 of your seeds. And again, a lot of the economy of the ancient Near East was not based on kind of the medium of exchange. It was based on bartering. And so the king, if there is a monarchy, is going to take from people to use for his own ends. So we see, again, the monopoly on violence being given to the monarch, and the idea that this kingship will only be able to propagate itself by means of coercively taking the products and the property of other people. So he's going by appointing a monarch, people are going to have to pay more to the monarchy, and the monarch is going to use the property of those in Israel for his own purpose. And he's going to have all kinds of servants, and he's going to have this giant kind of monarchical apparatus. And so again, God warns the people what is going to happen to them if they appoint a king over themselves, and the people are so convinced that they want to be like the nations that are around them that they say, there will be a king over us, and we want to be like all the other nations. And so the irony here is that if you read the rest of 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, and Ezra and Nehemiah, and then 1st and 2nd Chronicles too, which are a retelling of 1st and 2nd Kings, things are not good when Israel implements a monarchy. There are only a handful of good kings, and even the good kings like King David, who will become a model for the Messiah, the eschatological king of Israel, even a good king like David doesn't avoid all of the trappings of power that come with kingship. And so if we're looking at 1 Samuel chapter 8, this shows, I think, better than any other passage in the Old Testament, the suspicion that the ancient Israelites would have had toward the ancient Israelite intellectuals or ancient Jewish intellectuals, depending on when you believe 1 Samuel was written or composed here. But again, if you want to take a look at the way that they would have understood monarchy, it's that monarchy leads to war and violence, and monarchy leads to overtaxation, and monarchy leads to servanthood by those that are under the monarch. And Israel chooses monarchy instead of trying to serve their God, because they want to compromise their identity as the people that God called to be separate from the nations. And the rest of the very sad story of 1st, 2nd Samuel, and then 1st and 2nd Kings shows Israel continuing to degenerate because of the monarchy. It causes nothing but problems for the people of Israel. And again, even the best like David and Josiah, they still have plenty of problems because you cannot escape the trappings that come with monarchy. So again, this is where we're at this point in the podcast. We got about 10 or 15 minutes left, hopefully, because there's another author that I want to introduce real quick that I think really does a great job of explaining this passage in more detail. But again, we're not imposing Murray Rothbard's concept of statehood on the Old Testament, but it is very obvious that the themes are similar, and the suspicion that the writer of 1 Samuel had towards monarchy are the same suspicions that Murray Rothbard had towards modern nation states. So very, very, very important that we keep those concepts in mind. And again, one of these days we're going to get around to doing the entire Old Testament story. I wish that I could complete it here, but because we need to wrap this up at some point, I want to leave you with that model. Again, 1 Samuel 8 is a great place to go if you want to understand the biblical critique of monarchy. But I think we need to flesh it out in just a little bit more detail. There are very few biblical commentators, and I've read a lot of commentaries on the Old Testament. I'm very interested in the Old Testament, and for me, especially when I was in college and I was working on my master's degree in biblical studies, that was the first time that I read the Old Testament from start to finish was like my sophomore year of college. So I was really far behind. I read the New Testament over and over and over again in high school, but I could never quite get around to reading all of the Old Testament. And when I started reading commentaries about the Old Testament, learning about the covenant and kind of the big story of the Old Testament of Israel and God calling them and creation and all of that stuff, the Old Testament actually makes a lot of sense. But one of the things that the commentators of the Old Testament don't often do is deal with the problem of monarchy from a philosophical perspective. And so there was a couple of years ago, I was given the opportunity, this was right before COVID, to teach a class on the Old Testament at my church. It was like a 6-week special where we went through the entire Old Testament. And I was looking for a good short introduction for that class. And the book that I found was a book that I think was written in 2018 or 2019 maybe. And I'm 2018. I'm gonna butcher this guy's name. But the Old Testament scholar who wrote it is, I think, Zvi Novik is, I think, how you pronounce his name. That's Tzvi Novik. I'm gonna put obviously a link to this in the show notes. But the book is called An Introduction to the Scriptures of Israel. And again, in 2019, I was already a libertarian, and I already consider myself a libertarian, but I hadn't really started diving into political philosophy in any sort of, I hadn't read Rothbard or Hayek or Mises or any of those people at this point. But in this book, as I was reading through it to prepare for my class, there's an entire chapter in this book that deals with the philosophical problem of monarchy in the Old Testament, from like that kind of philosophical perspective. And it's chapter 7 in this book. Again, the book is called An Introduction to the Scriptures of Israel by Tzvi Novik. And again, I'm sorry, Tzvi, if I'm mispronouncing your name, but he deals head on in a very commendable way with the problem of monarchy in the Old Testament, and specifically the ways in which the writers of 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then also 1st and 2nd Kings, which I think it was one writer for all 4 of those works, or at least one group of writers for all 4 of those works. That's beside the point. But he deals with the problem of monarchy in those texts head on. So I want to go through a couple of the points that he makes in his book, because I think that they're really relevant in trying to understand the ways that the writers of the Old Testament grapple with monarchy and with the government in general. So he says this, in the previous chapter, this is the beginning of chapter 7 on page 77 in his book. In the previous chapter, we learned that at Sinai, God covenants with his people Israel and furnishes them with a law code. In comparing this law code, the covenant code, with the laws of Hammurabi, we found that, relative to the latter, the former downplays status distinctions among people. So again, the law that God gave to Israel, the covenant, was designed to downplay the distinctions of status among their people. The covenant code does not distinguish between elite and commoner, nor between the family patriarch and the members of his household. Most importantly, for our immediate purpose, there is no human king. The lawmaker is not a Hammurabi, but God. God alone is king, and in his presence, status differences among humans become insignificant. That's beautiful. And again, the covenant that God made with Israel was designed to be a social equalizer, and God himself alone was king. And so this is really important as well. And then he's going to go on to say later on, we will find that the Bible is suspicious of monarchy, both on universalist grounds and on particularist grounds, but that it is willing to endorse, even exalt, a king who humbles himself before God. It is from this foundation that the concept of the Messiah, so central for Judaism and especially for Christianity, will emerge. So again, there is this acknowledgement by Novick that the king is not the biblical ideal. God is supposed to be the king. But if Israel is going to have a king, that king is going to have to humble himself before his people and not exalt himself. Because again, the entire contract that God made with Israel was designed to eliminate the distinctions between people within the family of God. And it doesn't mean that people are not different or whatever. Everyone has different functions, even within the Old Testament law, but that before God, everyone has the same worth and the same value. So he is going to identify, Novick is, two of the problems of kingship, two of the problems of monarchy that are articulated in 1st and 2nd Samuel. And so there's, again, some very, very important points that he makes here. And so he says this, of course, even before the Israelites had kings, they were guided by leaders such as Samuel. What distinguishes kingship from the ad hoc leadership system that preceded it is kingship's dynastic element. Because a king is succeeded automatically by his son, kingship limits God's ability to choose or confirm the Israelites' leader, and so distances God from them. And then the second point that he's going to make here, but there's a second and subtler way in which the desire for a king represents a rejection of God. And it comes across in the final words of the Israelites' request to govern us like all the other nations. We've talked about this already. To request a king is to seek to be like other nations and thus to reject the yoke of election, God's choosing of his people. This concern is a matter not merely of principle, but also of practice. Sorry about that. A king is inevitably a cosmopolitan figure, an international player, one among many kings. Hence, he will naturally enter into treaties and marriages with foreign monarchies and thus entangle Israel with the nations and with their gods. It is for this reason that God, in the above passage, compares the request for a king to past crimes involving worshiping other gods. So again, the two critiques that Novick is going to have here of monarchy that are articulated in 1 Samuel is this idea that God can no longer choose a judge or a prophet to lead his people in times of national need. Instead, there's going to be a hereditary monarchy. And the problem that we always run into with hereditary monarchs, whether it's the Roman emperors or whether it's Charlemagne and his ineffective sons, is that you might have a really great king and then his sons might be terrible. There's no guarantee that you are going to have continuity of good leadership. And so since God can no longer choose Israel's leaders, this is going to distance God from them. And then again, the second point was the most important point that we made before, is that Israel is going to lose its distinction. It's going to look like all of the other nations, and it's pretty hard to be a light to the nations when you look and act just like them. So he's going to go on page 80 here. The critique of kingship in the Bible can thus be analyzed into universalist and particularist dimensions. And again, this is I highly recommend buying this book. One of the big points that he makes in this book is that the Old Testament has themes that are universal and also themes that are particular to Israel within the Old Testament. And so he's going to deal with both of them. So the universalist critique, and this is really important, a critique not specific to Israelite kingship is bound up with the elevated stature of the king. He is godlike and so can easily come to displace God and to set himself above the people as a tyrant. The Bible levels the same critique against other non-Israelite kings. For example, the king of Tyre, whom Ezekiel condemns for saying, "I am a god, I sit enthroned like a god." The particularist critique, by contrast, is specific to Israelite kingship and follows from Israel's election. Because Israel is duty-bound to worship God alone, it should stand apart from other peoples and from their gods. An Israelite king, however, will inevitably make alliances that intertwine Israel with other peoples and thus with their gods. So again, a really, really great point here that the monarchy will always lead to people having elevated status over others in society, which is a deep problem from the perspective of the writers of the Old Testament. The particularist critique is that Israel will lose its distinctive identity. It won't be able to fulfill God's promise to Abraham that his family will be a blessing to the nations. And so Novick is going to go on. There is one really good king, the model king, which is obviously King David, and the story of King David is told in 2 Samuel. David is going to become the archetypal king, but he still has some serious problems, and you can read 2 Samuel yourself if you want to see just how bad David gave in to the temptations and the trappings that come with being a king. And so we are going to Novick's going to identify 3 ways that God is going to set a limit to the power of the monarchs. That if Israel is going to have a king, the king must have 3 limits. So he says this: reflecting on the text that we have examined, we may identify 3 ways in which the Bible sets a divine limit on kingly power. First, the king must be humble or metaphorically short. Second, the Bible coordinates the dynasty with the temple. The king's house is bound up with God's house. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the king is confronted by God's messenger, the prophet. So the 3 checks that God places upon monarchs are that monarchs are required to be humble. They have to have humility before God's people. The entire temple system is going to subordinate the power of the king. That the temple system should really be in the covenantal theocracy of the Old Testament, where the true power resides, because in the temple, God alone is worshipped. And then obviously the prophets, who stand outside of the system and critique the system when it goes too far. So even within the Old Testament, Novick is going to say that there are extreme limits that are placed on monarchy. And again, I think all of these concepts are very relevant when it comes to understanding the Bible's interpretation of statehood. And again, in 2 Samuel 7, we don't have time to get into this in depth today, but God is going to make a promise to David that somebody, somewhere in his line, will one day live up to that standard, that one day there will be a king that is humble, that will submit to the temple, and that will have the approval of the prophets. I couldn't imagine who that is. Anyways, in the conclusion here, the conclusion of this chapter is brilliant. I'm going to read it real quick. We're going to get into my concluding thoughts, and then we'll get out of here for today. But Novick ends the chapter this way. He says, the Bible flags the institution of monarchy as dangerous on both universalist grounds, that is, because the king displaces God, and on particularist grounds, insofar as the king narrows the gap that ought to separate Israel from the other nations. While the prophet serves as a check against these dangers, ultimately it rests upon the king himself to make monarchy work by humbling himself before God and maintaining a distance from foreign kings. David of Bethlehem of the tribe of Judah accomplishes this feat, and while far from perfect, he wins God's eternal love. Indeed, as we noted in discussing the Exodus, if Israel is God's son, then the Davidic king enjoys the same status. I will be a father to him, and he shall be a son to me, which is a quotation of 2 Samuel 7:14. You are my son, I have fathered you to this day, which is Psalm 2:7. The exaltation of the Davidic king has no little role to play in the history of Judaism and Christianity. We will turn later to the rise of Messianism and the Second Temple period, but for now, we may note that the word Messiah is the anglicized form of the Hebrew Mashiach, which means one who is anointed, and which refers in the first instance to the king, whom the priest invests in his role by anointing him with oil. When we speak of the Messiah, we speak of the Davidic king. The word Christ, in turn, is nothing other than the Greek translation of the Hebrew Mashiach. Roughly a millennium after David, when the followers of Jesus came to think of him as Christ, they were taking him to be the rightful heir of David and thus the Son of God. Judaism does not recognize Jesus as Christ, but continues to look forward to a Christ, a Davidic king, to the point that the renewal of the moon each month is taken as a sign, according to the Talmud, that David, king of Israel, lives and endures. A little bit to think about there about the application for Christians. But we're focusing on the political philosophy today, not all the crazy Jesus stuff. So not that obviously those two things are one and the same here. So what are we going to do with all of this? So obviously, living in the 21st century, we do not have a monarchy. Based on Rothbard's definition of the state, the monopoly of violence that the states generate revenue through confiscation, I think that Christians need to be skeptical of all forms of human power, whatever form that might take. Because again, the exact same critique that both Rothbard and the writer of 1 Samuel levels against state power, whether it's Rothbard in the modern states or 1 Samuel and Israel's kingship or kind of kingship in the ancient Near East in general, there are a lot of overlaps between those two categories. And so we should always be skeptical of all forms of human power because, again, like embedded in the text of 1 Samuel 8 is that when human beings are given an opportunity to abuse power, they're going to take it. And that goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3, that it takes a very special person to a very humble person to be able to turn down the trappings of human power. The second thing is that, again, humans cannot be trusted with power and will often use it for their own gain, which means that we should advocate for a decentralization of power. And this is why I think libertarianism is so important for Christians. If you read the Bible, you should be skeptical of all governments because all governments are going to have to exercise power in ways that harm other people. And so, and again, this is one of the reasons why I am a libertarian. After reading through all of these passages in the Bible, and we're going to look at the New Testament, like I said, next week, it's very obvious that the writers are skeptical of human power and they don't trust people to be given lots of power. So if we are going to have institutions of power in society, those institutions need to be as decentralized as possible. In other words, it's like Montesquieu's idea of checks and balances within a federal government, only taken to a much more extreme conclusion. We need to make sure that not only are there checks to power, but that no group can possibly have more of a check than another group. So the further down the line that we decentralize power, the less likely it is that human beings are going to be in a position to exercise dominion over other people, that by taking power away from a massive state and investing it in smaller and smaller political units, we lessen the risk that one person or one group of people will use that power for their own ends against other people. The other one, and this is kind of what Novick was getting at the end of his passage. Although I'm pretty sure that Novick is Jewish, I don't know for sure. You can check me on that. So I'm not sure if Novick believes that Jesus is the Messiah. But again, as he said, as Christians, we cannot put our hope in politicians. Israel wasn't supposed to put their hope in politicians. Instead, we're supposed to put our hope in God and in God's Messiah, Jesus, who is the true Davidic king. And again, this is the problem with all forms of big government politics and with Christian nationalism or the progressives' natural inclination to trust everything that the state tells them. We don't need political saviors. Instead, we need political leaders who will be humble and who want to limit and decentralize power. Insofar as we have to have a state, that state has to be self-limiting. We have to create institutions where people cannot take the reins of power and use it to serve their own ends. And at the end of the day, Jesus is the true king. Jesus is the model Messiah, and we should not put our hope in any other political institution. And I think we can and should support candidates without placing any sort of eschatological hope in them. Like your favorite politician, even if Dave Smith becomes president in 2024 and we elect a completely libertarian House and Senate, I think it would be great because I think that they would decentralize power and we'd solve a lot of problems in our society, but we still cannot put our hope in the government at all. Instead, we have to put our hope in the fact that Jesus is the true king who has been raised from the dead, and that we are the people of God who have been empowered by the Holy Spirit to go out and be a light to the nations. That's our goal, and that one day we're going to be resurrected just like Jesus was. We should put our hope in that and not in these politicians and not in the state. Now, again, I want to say here that we should be ruthlessly critical when politicians overstep their boundaries. That doesn't mean that we have to be petty and vindictive. It doesn't mean that we have to be mean and condescending or rude, but we do need to hold people accountable when they cross the line and when their policies are directly designed to aggrandize themselves at the expense of other people. And again, if you look at the massive expansion of federal power in the United States over the last 100 years, we're dealing with not the exact same problem, but we're dealing with a very similar problem as Israel. Once you institute kind of a monarchical state, which our federal government, more or less acts like that, maybe oligarchy is a better way of describing it. But again, once you give people an almost unlimited amount of power, they're always going to use it to their own ends. And that's the story of the 20th and 21st century when it comes to government. And as Christians, we need to be critical of those that are in power when they overstep their boundaries. Again, I think it's really important too that as Christians, we focus on the mission of the church, which is to spread the gospel. We've talked about that on this show many times before, instead of trying to manipulate the state into mandating our values through legislation. Christian nationalism will not save you. It doesn't matter if your favorite politician is a Christian and they go to the same same church as you and they have all the same theological beliefs, we cannot legislate that and force other people to embrace our values, because if we're doing that, all we're doing is capitulating to that form of kingship that is not humble and that does not seek to serve the people. Instead, we need, as a church, to try to convince people through love and service that the gospel is true. We need to actually live out the values and the principles of our gospel. Again, I think that 1 Samuel is a libertarian adjacent gym. I know I just went over a lot of conclusions there. We're running kind of short, and hopefully in future episodes, we can take these ideas and kind of blow them up further. But I really appreciate you guys hanging on until the end. One more thing before you leave. I did create a website for my Old Testament course that I taught at my church a couple of weeks ago. It's a Google website, so it's not like the most technological advanced website in the world. But if you're new to Christianity, or if you're not really familiar with the Old Testament and you want some really good resources to help you get into the story of the Old Testament, I'm going to put a link to that website in the show notes. Again, the link is sites.google.com/GENUOT. Generations U was the Generations University was the name of the class that I taught. We were going to do a lot more, and then it kind of got ruined by COVID. So hopefully one of these days we can get back to teaching those classes. But if you've never made it through the Old Testament, or you have a hard time understanding how all of the pieces of the Old Testament fit together, I would recommend checking out my website. There are lots of good videos, book suggestions. I give a summary of every section of the Old Testament there. So a lot of really good stuff. So again, that's sites.google.com/GENUOT. Again, thank you guys for listening to this episode. I really appreciate it. I thought that this turned out really well, and I'm excited to hear your feedback on it. Again, I hope you guys enjoyed, and I will see you all next Tuesday.